On the other side of the aisle, Republican frontrunner Tiffany's preparing to join supporters. He'll be in Heartland tonight for his watch party.
And our Elise Noe is there right now. She joins us live with more on his campaign tonight. Elise.
Yeah, Cami, we're here inside Congressman Tiffany's primary campaign for the Republican nominee for governor. Now, as mentioned, we did see Mr. Tiffany arrive here about an hour ago, but doors don't officially open until about 7. So we will be keeping an eye out as this party really starts to take shape. And even though Mr. Tiffany is the heavy favorite against his only opponent, Andrew Manske, who, as we mentioned, ran a much smaller campaign, Tiffany's campaign isn't taking his foot off the gas. Today, the campaign announced a new 7-figure statewide ad campaign focused on education, healthcare, price transparency, and housing affordability. And that comes just a day after we reported Tiffany was encouraging Republicans to stick with the Republican side of the ballot rather than crossing over into the Democratic primary. So even in a primary where Tiffany, again, is the heavy favorite, Republican voters that his is something else to watch out for tonight. Tiffany's margin, turnout, and really what kind of around of the campaign understanding of that within the hour as his supporters Heartland. Elise Noe, Action 2 News.
Elise, thank you. Andy Manske, the only Republican challenger to Tiffany. He's casting himself as a working class outsider. Manske tells us he and his supporters will be out knocking on doors today, talking directly with voters before they head to the polls.